CEOs talk sustainability. Let me welcome on the show Mr. TV Narendran of Tata Steel to talk about India's thrust towards sustainability and also the ESG compliance dynamics of Tata Steel. Mr. Narendran, so good to have you on the show. And my first question, what do you think is India Inc. doing to get on to this journey on sustainability, and how do you see us faring versus the global peers?
Thank you, Nisha, for having me on the show. I think there's a lot for us to do in India, and this has to be a collective effort between the government and industry. Because as we're seeing in Europe, this kind of transition is complex, it's expensive. The government has to play a role, industry has to play a role, and customers have to play a role. Because everyone has to bear a part of the cost, because the industry will not be able to bear the cost by themselves. There has to be support from the government, and customers need to be willing to pay more for green products. So as far as India Inc. is concerned, I think there's growing recognition. Those of us in India Inc. who have a footprint outside India, particularly in Europe, already see what's happening there. The cost of carbon is going up in Europe. It's about 80, 85 euros per ton now. It used to be less than 20 euros a ton maybe 2-3 years back. We're seeing the carbon border adjustment mechanism being discussed, which can impact imports into Europe from other countries, so on and so forth. And a lot of money is being spent on creating the infrastructure to transition to green. So as far as India is concerned, I think the Prime Minister has made a good beginning by announcing the 2030 goals at Glasgow. India has also said net zero by 2070. I think what is important is to have a roadmap now, policy roadmap, infrastructure roadmap, so that companies can invest in transitioning into this future. And I think India has done a great job as far as green energy is concerned. But again, if you want process industry to shift to green energy, you need to have storage ecosystems. You need to ensure, regularity of supply. You need to ensure that you can take care of peak loading, so on and so forth. So I think a lot of consciousness is there, but a lot of work needs to be done.
That's right. You've really pinpointed the basic crux of this particular issue right now, TV Narendran, because there are lots of things that need to be developed. India Inc. will have to be given the tools as well as the infrastructure and the policy support to take this journey forward. Let's pick on each one of them one by one. Now, you spoke about the customers will have to pay for it. Now, when we talk about that, cost competitiveness is one of the lifelines of any businesses. Bottom line matters at this point, even though we may consider the ESG-led transition investments as investments per se, but currently it is a cost to the company. How is the ecosystem developing in taking part and contributing to this additional cost?
So that's why, Nisha, because if you really look at the cost, even if I look at an industry like steel, it was always cleaner and greener in some sense to produce steel by recycling steel, right? But still the blast furnace route dominates because the cost of producing steel through the blast furnace route is about $100 cheaper than the cost of producing steel through the electric arc furnace route, right? So if today a customer says, I'm going to pay you a premium for a lower carbon footprint, then the question is the customer has a choice to pay $100 more and use a different process route, right? So some of those process routes are available. And going forward, if you're going to use hydrogen and substitute coal with hydrogen, that's going to make whatever process uses hydrogen instead of coal more expensive, right? So either the margins of the industry should be able to afford that cost, because industry is also having to invest a lot of capital to transition to a greener process route, right? Or the government has to support, or the customer has to pay. Unless one of these happens, the business will become unviable, right? So I think that is a challenge. And that's why we need to think through this transition very well. Because even if you see in Europe, the gas prices have started going up, right? So if you suddenly switch from one source of energy to another, and you are going to see the next few decades of less and less investment in fossil fuels and coal and so on and so forth. So if there is a demand spike on energy, and the alternate supplies can't keep up with that, you will see cost spikes. And today those costs are impacting everyone, not just the B2B businesses. People's households are paying larger electricity bills in Europe, and governments are grappling with that. So I think there are a lot of complexities which we need to plan for. It's not going to be a smooth ride into a clean future. It is required, it is essential, we need to do it, but we need to have a deeper understanding of the cost and complexity of this journey.
That's right. And for manufacturing companies like yourself, which is essentially carbon emitting, to balance that, I want to understand first the technological part and then the policy support that you'll need.
Yeah.
On the technology part, do you think, TV Narendran, that globally, the European units are far ahead in terms of innovation when it comes to reducing their carbon footprint, and there India as a low cost producer may lose that status in this transition?
So, Nisha, I think if you look at steel industry, for instance, right, the coal which is used in steel industry is different from the coal which is used in a power plant. The coal we use in the steel industry is called metallurgical coal, right? So this metallurgical coal is not just an energy source; it is used as a reductant. You know, when you're converting the iron into steel. So if you need to substitute that coal, you need to substitute with something else, and hydrogen is a good substitute. Hydrogen can also be a reductant and a source of energy. But like I said, you need to have hydrogen available in plenty where you need to use it, because that means you need to create that hydrogen infrastructure to transport it and deliver it to the steel plants. And you need to be able to price it at a price at which the steel is no longer unviable, right? So these are the challenges. The other option is to continue to produce through the blast furnace route and use carbon capture and usage or carbon capture and storage options, right? Again, that needs to be built to scale, because a typical steel plant generates 2 tons of carbon per ton of steel. So if you look at any of the big steel plants, for the amount of carbon it generates, you need to have CCU and S at a much higher scale than you have today. The third option is to recycle steel, right? You take scrap, melt it, and if the source of energy is green, then you pretty much have green steel. But there is not enough scrap in the world to take care of the requirements of steel, because only about 40-50% of the steel is produced through the scrap recycling route.
Yes.
So the answer is a solution, a bouquet of solutions. It's not just one solution. And different geographies, like France is using nuclear energy as a green source of energy. Scandinavian countries are using hydro as a green source of energy. So different countries, depending on their advantages, will choose that energy source. India, as you said, has a big advantage on iron ore. We don't have much metallurgical coal. So to that extent, if we can have low cost hydrogen and we have iron ore anyways, we could continue to be very competitive. But for that, hydrogen needs to be made in plenty and available, particularly in the eastern side of India, which is where most of the steel is going to be made, because iron ore is there, right? So I think these are the challenges that we need to deal with. But I think the climate economy is also a great opportunity, just like the internet economy has been a great opportunity for the last 20-30 years. Over the next 20-30 years, businesses which don't exist today will come in, will scale up, and you will see a lot of champions even in India. So I'm confident that India will find its own solutions, and Indian steel industry will continue to be competitive.
Right. As India aims strides ahead in this particular landscape of ESG compliance. TV Narendran, what is it that the government now needs to do in terms of policies and regulations? And what about carbon credit market? And how do we
Yeah.
develop that? How much time could it take?
So I think there's a lot of learning we can have from Europe. And I say this because I've experienced what Europe is doing, right? So one is, like you said, create a carbon market that puts in some sort of a penalty for people who are emitting carbon, while at the same time, what Europe has done and what we should do is have a carbon allowance scheme, so that you're allowing industry some years to transition to a greener future and not just putting a cost onto them, which makes them uncompetitive, right? So Europe started a carbon market, free allowances for industry, and those free allowances over a period of time keeps reducing, so that you have time to transition and you have a motivation and incentive to transition. The second thing Europe is doing is spending a huge amount of money in building the infrastructure, because whether it's hydrogen, whether it's hydroelectric, nuclear, whether it's electrification of the economy, whatever it is, I think a lot of infrastructure needs to be built, and India needs to start building that infrastructure, because private sector can come in and maybe make hydrogen, but the infrastructure is like the power grids that you have to transport electricity across the country, which has also been significantly enhanced in the last 10 years. So we need to create that infrastructure which will help us transition into a green economy. Third is the policy roadmap, because how do you manage this transition? Again, the bigger companies can probably do it themselves with some support from the government, but there'll be a huge number of MSMEs who also need to make this transition, and they will need handholding, they will need support. You need to again create shared utilities, manage their costs, etc. The last thing is also the policy on trade. What Europe is doing about a carbon border adjustment mechanism, because the cost of producing anything in Europe is going to go up because of this transition to green, and they don't want somebody who's not so green to sell products in Europe. So they have a carbon border adjustment mechanism to, kind of preempt that. So we need to do all these things, and that's why I think it's important for government and industry to work together on this transition. They cannot, or we cannot work in isolation. I think the government is already doing that. There is engagement going on with industry, but we need to really, like I said, plan this well. I don't think anyone is debating the direction. I think for most of the last 20 years, the world was debating the direction. I think the direction is clear. Now the execution is key.
So now let's talk about Tata Steel under your leadership. Mr. Narendran, what is being done by Tata Steel to reach its net zero targets for the company?
So again, in Europe, we are already on that path. We've already announced that in Netherlands, where we have one of the most carbon efficient blast furnaces in the world. We've already announced that we are transitioning over the next decade to gas and hydrogen based steel production, which is much greener and cleaner. And of course, that is dependent on when gas and hydrogen is available for us to use at prices which make it viable. In UK, we are looking at leveraging the scrap which is available in UK, which is exported out of UK more and more, so that again you can make greener steel. But then the source of energy also has to be green. So these are conversations we're having with the UK government. In India, we've already announced that by 2025, we want to be at less than 2 tons of carbon per ton of steel and less than 1.8 tons of carbon per ton of steel by 2030. So we are building more and more carbon efficient blast furnaces. Whatever we are building, we will take a call on in the next 5-10 years whether we want to build any more blast furnaces depending on availability of gas and hydrogen in India. We have also set up a recycling business. We've set up the first recycling facility in Rohtak. We are setting the first that will feed into a electric arc furnace based plant in North India. So we want to service northern, western, and southern India through recycling route, and eastern India make steel using iron ore, so that over a period of time, our carbon footprint per ton of steel keeps reducing. We are doing a lot of work on technology. We are just last week or 10 days back had the first plant in the world, pilot plant in the world for injecting coal-bed methane, CBM, into the blast furnace. We've also done a pilot plant with a startup on carbon capture out of the blast furnace and to separate it into hydrogen and CO2, which can be used. So a lot of work is going on from a technology point of view as well. So I think there are multiple initiatives, and you will see Tata Steel as one of the leaders in this transition.
You spoke about the Netherlands plant. Can you give us more update on the solutions that the company is looking at on the probe against the company for pollutants being emitted by the manufacturing unit there?
So we've been told that the public prosecutor is going to investigate the complaints, and we have said we are happy to cooperate with them and share with them whatever information they want. I think we believe we are a very responsible corporate. We've been in that site for more than 100 years, and we have announced plans to transition into a cleaner and greener future. We are, as we stand today, one of the cleaner and greener steel plants in the world. So I think, we go there, as we said in our press release, we go into this investigation with confidence and with all cooperation that is required.
Right. And when we talk about the ESG compliance that is required by SEBI, where does Tata Steel stand there, and how do you think that's going to impact the overall ESG compliance by the listed companies?
So in principle, we are supportive, but I think the devil is in the detail. And I think we need to engage a little bit more on the detail. There are issues. It's not about just using regulation which has been used elsewhere. I think we just need to get into some of those conversations. We've given that feedback to SEBI. And I think we look forward to working with them to find regulation which is not prescriptive, but at the same time encourages more transparency, more responsibility, so that industry can and investors have a clearer view on what's happening. So in principle, we are supportive, but as far as the detail is concerned, I think we need to have a few conversations.
Right. While everybody is talking more about the E component of ESG, which is the environment, and that can be easily also understood because of climate consciousness parameters. But when it comes to the other two components, S as well as G, what are the efforts being taken by the company?
By the company.
Yes.
Yeah. So societal, that's been the foundation on which Tata Steel was built, right? The
Yes.
founder of the Tata Group said that the community is not just another stakeholder, but the very purpose of our existence, right? And that's a principle we've tried to live by for more than 100 years. So I think I'm not saying we are perfect, but I think, made a positive impact on the communities in and around wherever we operate, and we operate in some of the poorest parts of the country, right? So, and I think whether it's a mining locations, whether it's a steel making locations, whether it's a CSR we do, I think we take it very, very seriously, and we do it very, very sincerely. So I think that's very much part of our ethos, and it's reflected in our annual reports and the recognitions uh, that we get, etc. Even on the G part, the governance side, again, like I said, I think we always, as Tata Group, as Tata Steel, always tried to be a leader in this, not wait for the law, always be ahead of the law in terms of doing more than is required by law. And that's been the story on on all this over the years, right? So I think
Yes.
that's something which is in our DNA, but we will continue to uh, hopefully keep getting better and continue to look at the standards and expectations, because it's not just what is required by law. The expectations of the community are also changing, as we've seen in Netherlands, right? So I think we are conscious of the fact that the community is also going to be expecting more and more out of us. So we have the mechanisms in place to listen to the community and respond to that, and I think that's where we derive our strength from.
That's right. Community building, that has been the cornerstone of Tata Steel. And having visited your Jamshedpur facility, I can say that. But what about gender diversity? That's also
Yeah.
an important component of the ESG compliance and of the social angle of ESG. What is Tata Steel doing on that particular front?
So, Nisha, I think that's a very important question. There are obviously a lot to do. We've done a lot in the last few years, but there's a lot to do. We've also said that we want to increase our gender diversity, which today, as if I include all the employees of the company in single digits, we wanted to take it to about 25% over the next few years. But that requires not only a lot of actions internally, a lot of actions externally as well. Because as per the law, women were not allowed to work in the night shift, for instance. Now that becomes a very difficult constraint in a manufacturing environment where people work 3 shifts. So we worked with the government to say that we will provide the security, the infrastructure, the support, whatever is required. And women want to work, So if you want people on the shop floor in manufacturing, embedded, I mean, really in the thick of things in manufacturing, then the laws also need to change. And I think the new labor laws are addressing some of these things. Otherwise, you will only have women in the office kind of work, which I think doesn't do justice to women and doesn't help in improving the gender diversity beyond the level. We are going beyond women. I think we are one of the first companies to actively solicit and recruit transgenders. So we have transgenders in our mining locations. We've hired them. We have a policy. We also have initiative around that. We're doing a lot of work around that. And I think we want to be a pioneer. I think as far as labor is concerned, people are concerned, Tata Steel has always been a leader and a pioneer. And I think we will continue to do that. Again, not wait for the law to tell us what to do, but try and be ahead of it. But I admit that we could have been or should have been much better on gender diversity than we have been. But I think a lot of work is going on currently, and you'll see significant changes over the next few years.
Right. Some of the other manufacturing companies have told us that they have converting 40% of the total worker population towards the female workers as well. So hopefully gender diversity can come in manufacturing space as well and can overcome the constraints that are there. But TV Narendran, for other companies which want to embark on this journey, and especially from your sector, which are much smaller, what will be your key suggestions to those companies to start this process?
So first is for the leadership to fully understand, the subject. Maybe 5, 6 years back, uh, I taught myself the subject by going and attending sessions, listening to people, reading books, so on and so forth. And so did my entire leadership team. So I think that's very important, because leadership needs to understand this. It's not about ticking the box. It's an existential issue for many industries. It's going to be very much part of the way we work and live for the next few decades. Just like I said, the internet is very much a part of the way we work and live over the last few decades, right? So leadership needs to understand that. And leadership is not just about management leadership. We also went through a training program which included our directors, which included our union leaders, so that everyone in the company understands the subject. Then you need to assign resources for it. The transition, like I said, will cost money. You need to put your best people in it to drive it. It should not be something which is being done by people who have not been in the business. So some of our senior business leaders are driving this transition. It's not somebody who has spent all his or her life in sustainability driving it. It is business people driving it, so that it becomes a business issue and not just something that somebody sitting in an office does. So I think there's a lot that needs to be done, and I think a best way to track what's happening is to track what's happening in Europe. If you have a footprint there, you will know it. If you don't have a footprint there, always good to see what's happening there, because I think they are leading the world as far as creating the right policy and the ecosystem is concerned, and the rest of the world needs to learn from the journey that's happening in Europe. So I think that's what I would advise. And MSMEs, many MSMEs, they may be small, but they are impacted by what happens because they are suppliers to customers sitting in Europe or the US. And I think particularly Europe is going to start looking at supply chains far more deeply than they have been so far on many of these ESG parameters. And availability of capital is also going to change very rapidly. So I think this is a very, very important journey. It's not, just a theoretical journey. I dare say I'm also the president of CII. At CII, sustainability is part of our theme for this year, because 80% of CII's members are MSMEs, and we wanted them to understand the subject well, and that's why we've been doing a lot of work on this subject, during the year and even
That's
before.
right. More global companies with more knowledge, like yourself, have been creating a buzz and also imparting a lot of knowledge. But as you rightly said, in the beginning itself, that a lot more needs to be done. The infrastructure support, the policy support, and the technology all have to move hand in hand. So it could be just the beginning of the sustainability journey for India. And thanks so much, TV Narendran, for sharing your thoughts and giving us many insights on how a steel company can move towards less carbon emitting and more compliant with ESG standards. Thank you so much for joining us. And with that, it's a wrap on the show.